So we will present the numbers on the screen as we start our conversation. So I'm going to go to your favorite spot first and foremost, Michigan in the Big Ten, because a few things stand out here for me. Of course, you've got a defense that you rank as number 1, 2, and 2 in the 3 units on that side of the football, despite Ohio State and what they've done on that side of the ball. Iowa, Penn State, not as talented as they were last year. So in a defensive-minded league, Michigan still has the best defense.
I think so. I mean, I think the defensive line that won the game against Alabama, every one of those players that were in on those plays returns for this year. I don't think there is a more athletic linebacker tandem in the country than Ernest Hausman and Jayshon Barham, who I think could play his way into being a first-round draft pick next year. And then with the secondary, I mean, there's a reason why EA Sports has Will Johnson its highest-rated player overall. They had a depth issue at safety. They were returning 3 very good safeties in Quentin Johnson, Markari Page, and Rod Moore. Rod Moore blew out his ACL. It's iffy whether he'll play this year, so they needed a third safety. So what did they do? They went and took a starting safety away from Michigan State. They took a starting safety away from Tennessee, and you got to figure one of those guys will be good, right? You don't need them both to be. You just need one of those 2 guys to be a high-level Big Ten starter, and Jared Mangum's already proven that he is one. For example, he was honorable mention All Big Ten a year ago. So they've plugged that in. I think that, but I mean, the 2 teams you just mentioned, by the way, I mean, let's not undersell it, Mark. They factor pretty prevalently in my defensive rankings. I mean, I think it is very possible at the end of the year, when adjusted for opponent strength of schedule, the top 3 defenses in the country are going to be Iowa, Ohio State, and Michigan. It just in some uncertain order. And I think at the very least, all 3, barring one of them facing a rash of injuries, all 3 of them will be in the top 5 nationally. So it's not like I'm, gutting those teams by any stretch of the amount. You want to jump in the chat and say, hey, I think JTT and those guys and Tyleek, Williamson, all those guys ought to be number 1 defensive line and Michigan be number 2. I mean, okay. That's like asking me which ice cream's better, mint chocolate chip or chocolate chip cookie dough. I mean, I have an opinion, but I think they're both tremendous. So if you like the other, that's great, So I'm hardly underselling those teams in those same rankings if you look at them. So what's really relevant then is how you compare against the teams that'll make up the bulk of the narrative that determines your season. I mean, Michigan versus Texas at the beginning of the year is very random. They don't play very often. All right, they played one time ever, and it was in a Rose Bowl that went down to the wire. It's early in the year. I mean, we're replacing 13 NFL draft picks. They're replacing 10. We saw last year, Texas went to Tuscaloosa, won fairly convincingly by Alabama home game standards. But then at the end of the year, they were both in the college football playoff. A lot can change in 3 months. And so whenever you're doing handicapping, you're looking for constants so that there's the least amount of variance as possible. And the constant to me is that what is more relevant than anything else is how you stack up against the other teams in your league. And so that's why I do it that way. And so, yeah, I've got, Michigan ahead of Ohio State and Iowa in my defensive rankings. But if I did them 1 through 134, they might be 1, 2, and 3. In addition to just speaking to the ranking itself, but the narrative, the topic here was Chiron Moore. So you got him smack dab in the middle of Big Ten coaches with a 9 power rating. So I guess that would rank him number 9 in the Big Ten. How much did the 3-game stretch at the conclusion of the season, how much did that prove to you his worth as a head coach? It's one of the highest debut scores I've given a brand new coach. It's right up there with the score I gave to Ryan Day when he took over, because he also had a 3-game audition. Now, his 3 games, TCU was a neutral site game, if I remember right. And they were okay that year. I mean, nothing like at Penn State and top 5 Ohio State. But it was very clear that Urban Meyer had also turned the offense over to him. They had evolved from the power quarterback featured powered running game that Urban has, relied upon throughout his career to more of a pro-style passing attack. And that's clearly Ryan Day's fingerprints. And so I made the decision to just judge Chiron Moore the same as I did Ryan Day, because you can as we discussed with my coaching ratings, I could have just graded Ryan Day and Chiron Moore higher in their non-Power 5 coaching resume, or I could have applied the games they won as interims to their actual coaching resume. And I just did the former, but the points would have ended up the same. It wouldn't have changed where Chiron Moore was rated at all.
I completely agree, because what we're going to hear is Ohio State fans are going to point out that Ryan Day had to take the entire team and program on his back for 3 weeks while Urban Meyer was removed.
Mm-hmm.
Michigan fans are going to counter with, well, Chiron Moore had to take on tougher competition in more meaningful games, and both are true.
I think there's one move that was talked about a lot the last few months because it really affected people's perceptions of JJ McCarthy as a draft pick. Okay, and it was to show you, yeah, I agree that having a Hall of Fame coach there to help prepare you all week long makes a difference. I wholeheartedly agree with Buckeye fans on that. Okay, but the balls, for lack of a better term, that it took for Chiron Moore in the late first quarter to basically scrap the game plan they had at Penn State, where they from the jump we were playing a guard at tackle, and he could not guard either Chop Robinson or the other guy, that Adisa Isaac, who's also a top 100 draft pick. It didn't matter what side we put him on. He couldn't block. JJ McCarthy got banged up early on. He's a sitting duck back there. The balls that it took for him to scrap the game plan that him and Jimmy put together, and then to just say, you know what, man, we can't block these guys. So I don't think they can stop us. We ran it down their throats last year. Let's do it again. And to make that call yourself, and in that stadium and in that setting, that takes some real balls. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that.
You've got Ohio State as the number one team in the Big Ten with a 12-point lead over Oregon. Is your thought here, because we've seen Vegas come out with odds and other sites that actually favor Oregon, even though Ohio State seems to be the narrative favorite in the Big Ten, because number one, they've got a better quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
And then number two, they play the game at Oregon. So you do have the Buckeyes, though, as the best team in the Big Ten.
I do, and that kind of margin means that I would make them a prohibitive favorite to be the number one seed going into the Big Ten championship game. And if you look at the rest of the spreadsheet there, you're going to see the margin between Oregon, Michigan, and Penn State is much closer, according to my power ratings, than the margin between Ohio State and Oregon. Now, if you're handicapping that game situationally, there are reasons to pick Oregon. They're tough to beat at home, number one. And number two, they're going to have the better quarterback there. I mean, I think it is very possible Dylan Gabriel is putting together a college football Hall of Fame level career when his career numbers are all said and done. All right. And so if situationally, it's a tough spot for Ohio State. But I'm not handicapping that game. I'm handicapping an entire season. And Oregon has to go to Michigan later in the year, in November, in fact. And you got to figure that by then, Michigan will have some form of an offensive identity. It may or may not be, it may or may not be a lucrative one, but it'll be at least stable by that point in time in the season.
Steve, before we let you go, I want to take you back to your team, because this is what I'm seeing and hearing, is that immediately after the national championship game, with the glut of Michigan players headed to the NFL draft, of course, the most of any team in the sport, loss of the quarterback, loss of the head coach, that it was, okay, Michigan's down. They're going to lose 4 or 5 games this year. And that was the national narrative. Write them off for this next season. It seems to be swinging back, that people are taking Michigan more seriously as people like yourself educate people, and maybe people are looking deeper into the personnel that's returned. Do you feel, and then we see the national publications come out with generally Michigan in that 6 to 10 range.
I do think, I think there was an overreaction at first. And that doesn't mean we have not had significant losses, but I think what is being lost on people is we did it differently than Georgia and Alabama and Ohio State and Clemson have done, with the traditional, let's dominate the top 100 list of, the 24/7 composite recruiting rankings. We did it differently. We had a few star players that we recruited, like Donovan Edwards and who's still back, by the way, JJ McCarthy, and a few of those guys. We had a whole bunch of kids that were ranked somewhere between 150 and 400 that we took advantage of COVID years, okay, with extra eligibility, and now they're grown ass men, okay. And then we have our hits level in the transfer portal have been extremely high. on our hit level on the transfer portal. So it's a bit of a different route than, you know, the elite teams prior to us winning it. LSU would be in there too, and the way they've done it, where you can just look at their, like Bud Elliott does, just look at their blue chip ratio. Oh, it makes sense. They're winning the national championship. Okay. So we did it differently. And I think because of that, Mark, people don't understand the amount of talent and depth that was on this team last year. And they actually don't understand that it's actually the junior class that was actually the highest rated recruiting class of the last 4 years. The Will Johnsons, the Colston Lovelands. And then there were guys like Mason Graham that USC didn't come in on him until way late. They didn't think he was that good. He might be a top 5 pick in the NFL draft. Kenneth Grant was a 3-star. I mean, he'll be one of the, mark my words, he will be one of the stars of the NFL Combine in Indianapolis next February. All right. So that junior class that's going to dominate our roster this year is full of stars. And many of the guys that we lost, Mark, had more, not just JJ, Blake Corum had more eligibility. The way the roster management that's been done here is high level NFL level of roster management of what Jim and Chiron as his lieutenant, what Jimmy and Chiron did to manage this roster over the last few years, so they would have more than just one breakthrough year, but a window to try to win a natty. Okay. They really did a masterful job. They took full advantage of the COVID rules. They figured out with NIL, hey, we're not going to pay a bunch of 16-year-old kids who haven't played. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to pay guys who would be 5th and 6th round draft picks more than they would have made in the NFL, keep them back in school, but they don't have to be on scholarship. They're walk-ons. And so I told you last year, we had more than 100 guys on our roster who had previously who at some point had been on scholarship at Michigan. So they ingeniously figured out, if we can't beat Ohio State and Alabama and Georgia and now Oregon with the money Phil Knight's throwing around, if we can't beat them for the top high school players, then we'll just do, top 10, 15 classes, and we'll figure out how to keep our guys here and retain them longer. Now, so I knew our frontline players were going to be very good. What I was concerned about heading into the spring is what was the depth behind them. In the spring, the depth was better than I thought, because that's the thing that with Jimmy, that will be the true test of Chiron will recruit very well. If you look at the class he's putting together now, it's going to have more top 100 kids than Jimmy's last 2 or 3 classes did. But the player development under Harbaugh, and this goes back to Stanford, the amount of 3-star kids at Stanford that Harbaugh turned into NFL players, that is going to be the true test here. And that I was concerned about how much because you can't expect a rookie coach to be as good at player development as a guy that was 6 inches from, being one of only 3 coaches ever to win a natty and a Super Bowl in the history of this sport. All right. And so I wanted to see how good was last year's reserves. And I think there's a lot better depth there than what I thought. That's what I saw in the spring. More guys that I think are ready to play, because if they are, then I think we'll have good enough depth again to at least contend for the Big Ten championship.
And I'm guessing that if you could be given one piece of information, post-season information now, it would be the Michigan quarterback stat line to determine.
Right.
So I mean, 17, 18 touchdowns against 6 or 7 picks.
Right. I mean, to me, if I'll just tell you right now, if we had JJ back, I'd pick us to win the Big Ten again.